Well, hi, I'm Matt, one of the staff at Maybridge, and today I want to talk to you about something I am absolutely brilliant at. And when I say brilliant, I am probably selling myself short. Actually, there are no superlatives, no words to tell you how stupendously good I am at this thing, which means I'm very well qualified to talk about it today. And what is this thing, you may ask, that I'm so good at? And very simply, it's this. I am phenomenally good at judging other people. Honestly, I think I'm one of the best in the world. If there's even a tiny opportunity to do some mental gymnastics so that I can judge someone else and therefore make myself feel like I'm superior to them in some way, I can make it happen in an instant. Like that. Of course, that's a bit of a flippant introduction. Judging others is a very serious thing. And in our culture, it's quite strange. On one hand, don't judge people is sort of a mantra for our times. It's seen as maybe one of the worst things that you can do. But on the other hand, it's absolutely rampant. So much of our public discourse is smothered in judgments of other people, their actions, their motives, their credibility, their worth. We can't seem to get away from it, even though pretty much everybody, in theory at least, agrees that it's a bad thing. The problem of judging others is also very prominent in the Bible. One of the things people like when they read about Jesus is that he stands up to the bullies of his culture. All of the people he interacts with in the Gospels, whether it's prostitutes or peasants or fishermen, there's one group he particularly confronts, and that's the religious leaders of his day. And in particular, he confronts their judgmentalism, which annoys them no end, of course. It was a problem then, and it's a problem now. As a church, we've been looking particularly at a text in the New Testament, a book called James, which was written originally by a man called James, coincidentally, who was Jesus' younger brother. And the book is really practical. It's a compilation of wisdom for all times and all situations. And the bit we're looking at today is basically where James says a few lines about this classic problem of judging other people. And at face value, what he says maybe seems very straightforward, but actually it's very clever and it's so wise you should probably stroke your chin while you're reading it. So I'm going to read it to you now. I may or may not stroke my chin. And for those who'd like to know, it's James chapter 4, verses 11 to 12, if you'd like to know that sort of thing. And it goes like this. Don't speak evil against each other, dear brothers and sisters. If you criticise and judge each other, then you are criticising and judging God's law. But your job is to obey the law, not judge whether it applies to you. God alone, who gave the law, is the judge. He alone has the power to save or to destroy. So what right do you have to judge your neighbour? I want to make 3 points that I think come out of this. Don't judge people, sometimes judge people, and only God can judge people, which all sound completely contradictory to each other, but bear with me. First one, don't judge people. And really this is the obvious bit, the bit that people quite naturally will agree with. Don't judge people, no one has a problem with that. But James gives us a particular reason. He says, if you criticise and judge each other, you are criticising God's law. Judging other people isn't just thinking some negative things about them, it's an attempt to take God's role in their life. By implication, when you are judging someone, you are assuming yourself to be sort of in the God position. To be the sort of arbiter of justice and truth who knows best about their life, their motives and everything about them. Why do we do this? I think everybody does it. Why do we do it? The bigger picture of the Bible is that we're all made in God's image, which means that we're like him in certain ways, although we tend to mess those ways up and distort them. So because God is about justice and he likes justice and justice is a good thing, we like justice too. And in many ways, of course, that's a really good thing. But it goes wrong when we misapply it, we misuse it. And what James is getting at is not to say, go through life without making any judgments about anything that people are doing around you. That's impossible. What James is getting at is the problem of setting yourself up as God, of assuming that you know the truth and how to act on it when you don't. The reason we do it, I think, is because the feeling of superiority to another person is like a drug that we cannot help but be unconsciously addicted to. Like everybody else, right now I really value my exercise time each day. The one time when I feel like it's okay, I can get out of the house and get some fresh air. And sometimes I go for a run, sometimes I go for a long walk. And the other day, I went for a long walk. There was hardly anybody around at all, but even that gave me the opportunity to do some judging. Remember, I'm really, really good at judging people. And firstly, I happened to walk past somebody's house, and they'd left a table outside with some books on it, mostly children's books, with a note, and there were some rainbows all over the note, and the message said, "Take any book you like. I hope it brings you some cheer in these tough times." And I thought, well, isn't that nice? What a lovely, thoughtful thing to do. What nice people must live in that house. I made a judgment. But of course it was a positive judgment, so nobody would object to that. In fact, you may even applaud my judgment as a nice judgment, which of course would be a judgment on your part. You can't live without making judgments. Anyway, secondly, as I continued my walk, went a bit further on, I did some more judging. I got to the beach, and it was a little bit busier on the promenade, on the concreted bit, so I went and walked on the stones, where after a few minutes I came across a woman who was on her own, lying there, sunbathing. She wasn't wearing very much. She was all set to be there for a while, I'm pretty sure of it. Not exercising, as per the government guidance, is the only reason you can leave your house, or one of the only reasons. She wasn't shopping, and she wasn't helping anybody in need, so I judged her too. I thought to myself, wow, what a selfish woman. Everyone else is trying to do the right thing. Everyone's socially distancing and so on, and here she is, sunbathing on the beach without a care in the world. Obviously, I don't know this woman, I've never spoken to her, but in my head, a whole view of her character had formed in less than 2 seconds. That's a judgment, but it's a negative one, so I imagine more people would say, okay, yeah, you probably weren't doing the right thing there, that's not very good. And here's where we get to the nub of the problem of judgment, of when we as humans judge one another. Was it wrong for her to be on the beach, sunbathing, given all the present advice? Yeah, I think so, unless there's a good reason for her to sunbathe that I'm ignorant of, which is entirely possible. The problem is not with you or me making a value judgment on anything that we or anyone else does. The sort of judgment that is a problem, and the one that I very easily slip into, is the sort where the sort that messes the world up, is the sort where it's not only that we observe something that somebody else is doing, it's where we go one step further and think, they're doing that, I wouldn't, therefore I'm better than them. Which I confess I totally did with the sunbathing lady. I didn't articulate it, I didn't argue it, but really honestly, in that 2-second judgment, part of me said, I wouldn't do what you're doing right now, so I'm better than you. I am a substantially better character, and if you were more like me, it would be to your good. That way of thinking is so programmed into my brain, I can do it without even thinking about it, time after time, day after day. And you know what? I bet you can do it too. The problem of judging one another is not about disagreeing, it's not about having a certain moral position on something. This is subtle, but it matters. The problem of judging one another is about the assumption of superiority. I am better than them because. One of the ways I think this plays out in our society very clearly right now is in politics. It's not just some people take this view, which is more on the left, and some people take this view, which is more on the right. Very dangerously, I believe, it's become I or we are superior to them because we take this view and they do not. And it's less about discerning what's a good move, what's right and wrong, and more about the feeling of superiority, quite often. And so we quickly judge others, but we make excuses for ourselves too. We relabel our own weaknesses. I don't gossip, I'm just sharing a concern. I'm not critical, I'm discerning. I'm not lazy, I'm just relaxed. I'm not negative, I'm realistic. I'm not unreliable, I'm flexible. We judge other people harshly, but when it comes to ourselves, we are far more lenient. We say, well, it's not wrong, it's circumstances, or it's just my characteristic, it's just the way I am, it's just me. And so James says, knowing that this is human nature, don't do it, avoid it, be aware of it in your life and kill it. Judging other people is bad for you, it's bad for your relationships, and it's a little attempt to be God when you're not. So point 1, don't judge people, which leads us nicely to point 2, sometimes judge people. Sometimes judge people. That sounds like a complete turnaround from what I just said. But here is the thing. It's bad to set yourself up as God and make yourself the judge of everybody, but it's a good thing to, with humility and patience and love, look to speak the truth to people when they're going wrong in some way. You've got to be really careful, but it's still a good thing. James says, your job is to obey the law, not judge whether it applies to you. When James says this, he means, from his point of view, the Old Testament law, the code for life that most of his readers would have known really well. It was seen as God's way to live. So you think, okay, don't judge other people. That's not my business. I'll just get on with doing what God says. Just get my head down and do that myself. Great. But the thing is, if you obey God's law, you will 100% have to make value judgments about all sorts of things through life. And not only that, but following God will require you, not just permit you, actually require you to speak up sometimes about what other people do. In our culture, this is not seen as a good thing whatsoever. We can't palate this. The American author and minister Rick Warren puts it really well. He says, our culture has accepted 2 lies. The first is that if you disagree with someone's lifestyle, you must fear or hate them. The second is that to love someone means you agree with everything they believe or do. Both are nonsense. You don't have to compromise convictions to be compassionate. I think he's dead right on that one. Without being judgmental, all of us sometimes have to make judgments. In fact, I think we regularly do. And sometimes we need to act on them because sometimes it's more loving to speak up than remain silent. When James wrote this, I think he was thinking of some words that his big brother Jesus had said many years earlier in a particular message that Jesus gave that has become known historically as the Sermon on the Mount, his most famous sermon ever. And in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 7, it records the Sermon on the Mount. And see how similar Jesus' words are to the ones that we read from James. Jesus says, do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you'll be able to see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Now, of course, there's a lot in that. But what I think is really interesting is the whole thing about the speck and the plank. And it's very deliberately a ridiculous verbal picture. Imagine if I went round with a huge plank of wood on my eye, telling people they had a tiny speck in their eye and they needed to do something to fix it. It would be ridiculous. In the same way, if I was the biggest show-off in the world, it would be absurd for me to critique someone else for showing off too much. It would be completely ineffective. They would never take me seriously. But Jesus does not say, remove the plank from your own eye and then carry on your life with no reference to what anyone else is doing because you don't want them to feel judged. No, no, no. Jesus assumes, having removed the plank, you will be able to help somebody else with the speck. In other words, when you, with integrity, when you can say, when you've dealt with your own stuff, it might be appropriate to approach somebody else about the speck in their eye, about the stuff that's going wrong in their own life. For example, if your friend is always gossiping about other people and you notice it and you think you should say something about it, make sure you're not gossiping first. And then when you approach them, you can even tell them that you've had to work on it too. Tell them about the plank that you've needed to remove from your own eye, in other words. And you know, if you do it that way, with humility and warmth, it's very hard to be accused of being judgmental. So second thing, sometimes judge other people, with caveats. Third thing, only God can judge people. James is very clear on this. God alone, who gave the law, is the judge. He alone has the power to save or destroy. Now, doesn't that sound ominous? I don't think I've met anybody who instinctively loves the idea that God might judge them. We don't like being judged by anyone, let alone God. And it's not just that we all judge other people, which we do I think we all hate the feeling that we're being judged by somebody else too. I am willing to bet that whoever you are, however old or young, whatever culture, whatever background you're from, you don't like the feeling of being judged. I think it's just a universal human thing. And what is it about judgment that we hate so much? For me, I hate the idea that someone presumes to know my motives and my thoughts. I don't like the idea that I'm being unfairly assessed and reviewed, and that someone would presume to know what's going on in my head. But what's much worse in being judged is when someone is completely on the money. It's when someone judges you and they're right. How annoying is that? My wife is amazing at this. Sometimes she'll accuse me of something, and if she's wrong, it's fine. I'm not worried about that at all. In fact, I can sort of gloat and feel a bit smug about it. But when she's right, it's annoying. And sometimes she has such a low expectation of me, which is warranted. She'll answer her own questions. She'll say, "Did you put the dishwasher on?" "No." And I'll sometimes go, "Yes, actually, ye of little faith. If you look in the kitchen right now, you will see that it's mid-cycle." That's really satisfying, but very, very rare. It's terrible when she's right, which unfortunately for me is most of the time. We hate the feeling of being judged because we fear being minimised in some way. We fear that we aren't good enough somehow. You will always find people are always most prickly about being judged when it's something they get their identity from. How they do their parenting, how they dress, their sexual and relationship choices, how intelligent they are. Nobody cares if they're judged for something they don't get their identity from. My handwriting is absolutely awful. I can barely read it myself sometimes, but I don't care about that. You can mock me all day long and I'll laugh with you. Why? Because I don't get my sense of identity from being able to write nicely. But of course, if I think I'm being judged as a bad husband, I'll be a little bit less happy and less relaxed. The great thing is, God's judgment is definitely real, but it doesn't minimise us. It dignifies what we do as being significant. But the way that God judges is entirely fair. We don't want to be misjudged. We don't want to be unfairly blamed. That absolutely will not happen with God. His judgment is 100% fair because he's not judging you or me like everyone else does, piecing bits together, guessing motives and so on. He just knows. He knows that, for example, when everyone else thinks you're brilliant and you know that you've done something to sort of trick them into thinking so. He knows that when you don't even realise it and you're being selfish or arrogant or proud. You and I only see the tip of the iceberg. God sees the whole, so his judgment is entirely fair. We can have no complaint whatsoever when God judges us. God ensures that justice is always done. In the final summary of all things, when the world ends and the universe as we know it is done with, God will ensure that justice is done. It's in his nature. Wrongs will be righted. Debts will be called in. Everything that should be paid for somehow will be. All those who raped and murdered and got away with it, justice will be done. Those who lied and stole, justice will be done. Those who abused and misused, justice will be done. Those who went round judging people and presuming the role of God, justice will be done. God alone, who gave the law, is the judge, says James. That probably all sounds a bit bleak. Judgment doesn't sound fun. But let me tell you another story. A number of years ago, I was thinking about doing some more study, do some part-time academia, and I wanted to do a master's in theology, but the options were really expensive. And then I heard that one particular college was running a competition. It was London School of Theology. They were running a competition to get a course of your choice, 100% funded, and all you had to do was win this competition, you got the whole thing. And so I thought, well, that sounds pretty good as a prize. I'll have a go. And there was a whole process, and it turned out I was very fortunate to get through it all. And then it got to the final, and there was 3 of us left in the final. And the final was that you had to do a short talk, 5 minutes, to all the graduates from the college from that year and a panel of judges. And so we all went down to this event. There's a huge marquee. I had no idea what it was going to be like. It was a type of judgment, of course. And then it was time to do the talks. And the other 2 guys went first. They did theirs. And then I got up, gave my little talk. And then the judges said, okay, well, it's going to take about an hour to make a decision. And so Naomi and I went out to get a burger outside. And then for a little while we weren't in the room, they announced that I'd been fortunate enough to win, which was brilliant, fantastic. I got my Masters for free. What was slightly disappointing, though, is that I wasn't there for the proclamation of my victory. That would have been nice. You see, when you're being judged and the verdict is positive, you don't run away. You want to be there. It feels great. If you've ever won any sort of competition or got a good school report or even got test results back from the doctor that are positive, it's a great feeling. Being judged in some way is actually something to embrace if the result is a big thumbs up. And in Jesus, it's possible to look at the judgment of God and embrace it, because God has found a way, despite what we're like, where judgment will happen and justice will be done. And he will look at each of us and know the complete truth. And yet, despite all our wrongdoing, all the ways we make ourselves God's enemies through judging others amongst other things, the verdict will be an unquestionable thumbs up. You know, when the Bible talks about God's judgment, it sometimes uses language as if it's in a courtroom. Imagine God is the father, God's the father, and he's like this judge, and he's got the garb and the wig on and everything, and the hammer, and it's all this sort of courtroom with all the wooden benches and stuff. And Jesus is the lawyer defending you and me. And when you imagine Jesus defending you in court, if you're a Christian, you know that Jesus is the one, he's on your behalf, he advocates for us. And when you imagine him advocating for you like a lawyer before God, if you're anything like me, you imagine him saying something like this. Okay, Father, I'm here to represent Matt, and I know he's been a bad boy yet again. I know he keeps sinning. It's pretty much endless, isn't it? But you're gracious and loving. Seeing as it's me, your son, representing him, why don't you let him off again just one more time? Go on, do it for me. That's how I often picture it. But that is actually not how it goes in the metaphorical courtroom. That's not what happens. Because Jesus has died and risen again, and I've trusted him, the dynamic is entirely different. When Jesus represents me in the cosmic courtroom, he's not on the defensive pleading for my freedom. Jesus probably would say something more like this. Yes, Father, it's true that Matt has done all sorts of bad things. He's caused loads of damage. Nobody denies these facts. But the debt is paid because I've paid it. So not only do I have a strong case to make as his advocate, but on the cross, through the cross, on the basis of my own blood, I don't just ask that Matt is set free. I demand it. I insist on it. There is no case left to answer because it has already been settled. So do you see? Even though God has every right to be angry with us, setting ourselves up as our own little judgment gods, he doesn't just release us because he's trying to be nice. It's actually now justice for him to do so. If you trust Jesus, it would be unjust. It would be criminal for God to give you a verdict of guilty. So do followers of Jesus need to worry about being judged? No, because we already know the outcome. It's not overconfidence either, because it's not ourselves that we're trusting. Jesus takes the righteous anger of God at how we behave, all our judgmentalism and everything else, onto himself. He subs in for us. He takes it so that his people don't have to. There's many implications to this, obviously. There's a day-to-day one I have to mention, because it comes up for a lot for me in conversations. A lot of Christians walk around with a constant feeling that God is a bit disappointed with them, that he's just a bit fed up with how they are. But that cannot make sense. The only thing that would disappoint God is sin, and he's not just disappointed with sin, he's downright furious. It invites his anger and his judgment. But if you've trusted Jesus, God looks at you and he sees his record, which means he's delighted with you. He's not some sort of fuzzy, ambivalent in-between, we'll see how the day goes. He's delighted with you. And if that sounds too good to be true, you're starting to see what God is about on a whole new level, because that is the truth. So those were three things. Don't judge, sometimes judge, and only God can judge. Let's give it a little bit of application to our locked down lives right now. Firstly, the thought of don't judge people. The fact that I'm talking about this now, if you're paying attention, over the next few days you'll notice what you say. You'll notice when your mind jumps into judging other people. Choose not to. Choose to think the best of them, or at least ask questions to get you to what's really going on if you need to. You may be cooped up in a house where things aren't in the normal pattern. You might be presuming certain motives on someone else. You might be relabeling all your own issues and problems and mistakes so that you feel better about yourself rather than just owning up. Decide not to. Decide not to. Second thought was sometimes judge. Is there anyone around you for whom this corona crisis is bringing out the worst? They're stuck at home and there's nowhere to hide. Is it appropriate for you to say something, to raise something? If you do, it's always better to start by acknowledging your own shortcomings and sympathising. That normally makes for a better conversation. But always make sure, in effect, you've removed the log from your own eye before you even start to seek to help to remove the speck from somebody else's eye. And third thought, if only God can judge, who do you need to just let go of? There's every chance that there's someone in life that you judge a lot, maybe a number of people. I can think of people I've not even seen in years who sometimes just jump into my head and irritate me when I think about their behaviour and ways that they've been, especially when I make presumptions about why they did what they did, and I don't know the whole story. But if only God can judge, you and I just need to let go of it and leave it to him. He knows the full truth, and we don't. And behind all of this, of course, is the great news that in Jesus, God judges us, and those who follow him have an absolute certainty of getting a thumbs up. In the end, in him, there is absolutely nothing to fear in judgment. Let's leave the judging to God and steer clear of doing it ourselves. Have a good week.